Hey, good morning. This is Bill Quain. I'm sitting here in beautiful Ocean City, and I'm going to be talking to you about the history of a terrific institution in Atlantic City, which is the Atlantic City Boardwalk. It's June 4th, 2020. As I'm doing this, we're right in the middle of the stupid COVID pandemic type thing, and what's really interesting is Atlantic City is planning on reopening this summer, probably in this is June 4th. I think for the July 4th weekend, they're talking about reopening. We'll see how it goes. So kind of historic times as we talk about the history of the Atlantic City Boardwalk. So here's what we got. We got a great picture here of Atlantic City looking from the ocean. This is somebody really tall who took this picture. Because it's maybe it's probably a drone, I guess. But anyway, now listen, Atlantic City, we know it and love it because we go to school there and that sort of thing. And I know I've told you in other videos that I've done that my family has a long history at the Jersey Shore, more in Ocean City than Atlantic City, but in the 1930s, my grandparents had a grocery store in Atlantic City, back up towards the inlet area there, which not really visible in this part, but we're going to be talking about some of the places along the boardwalk that my grandparents used to frequent. I frequented it when I was a kid because my aunt and uncle used to come here every summer with my cousin Ted, and Ted was an only child, and a lot of times they'd either bring me or my brother with them. So I spent a lot of time in Atlantic City as a kid too, up on the boardwalk, on the beach, etc. All right, next slide, please. All right, now here's a view of Atlantic City from the bay side. Just give you a little perspective there. It's not a very wide island. I live in Ocean City, which is even less wide, even more narrow than Atlantic City is. But so here's what's kind of interesting. This island was just scrub brush and sawgrass and that kind of stuff. There weren't many trees on it at all. I mean, any trees were like scrub trees because it was so windswept and everything. But the Lenni Lenape Indians used to come out to Atlantic City, to Absecon Island, and they used to spend summers out there. So they were kind of the first tourists out there. And it was nice because you come out and you got all the fish on both sides of the island there, the bay and the beach to catch. Water was not too plentiful, but there's enough rain that you can take care of that. And so then and here's what happened. Here's how this place got developed. There's a doctor named Dr. Pitney. And for those of you who go to Stockton and you've been at the main campus, the Pitney Pub is out there, a great restaurant. Dr. Pitney was looking at Atlantic City as a place for to restore health to people. Now you got to understand there was nothing there, and so when he went out there, it was hard to get there. You had to get out there by ferries from the mainland, that sort of thing. In 1854, he and a man named Osborne built a railroad from Camden down to Atlantic City. And that was a pretty big deal because you had there was a lot of marsh and stuff like that. You had to sink piers to run the tracks along, etc., and bring over. And when you got there, it was just pretty much sand. But it began to bring people in looking for health, and some guest houses were built. Atlantic City has a huge history of guest houses, and then some hotels were built, restaurants. Interestingly, at the terminus of the railroad where it came onto the island there, in the summertime a whole tent city existed there with selling food, and there was bands playing, and there was portable bars set up, and all kinds of entertainment. So that was really the first entertainment hub in Atlantic City. And interestingly enough too, the train started in Camden. Now for many years there was no train across the Delaware River. from Philadelphia to Camden, and that didn't come till later, and or at least so that it could be connected. Even when I was a young man, you took the train up to the Camden area, then you took the Lindenwold high-speed line into Philadelphia, so you actually change trains and so on. But that whole the railroad coming here was a big deal, because that's how people traveled back then. People didn't have cars, and certainly were not the roads to drive down here. And now I don't know how the naming of some of these streets came along, because you notice it says there that the north-south streets, those are the streets that run parallel to the ocean in the bay, those bear the names of great bodies of water. And what always drives me crazy about Atlantic City is that Pacific Avenue is closer to the Atlantic than Atlantic Avenue. I know it's too late to change it, but it just drives me crazy. Next slide, please. All right, so now all this is great, but where did the boardwalk come from? Well, this is really interesting. I mean, you know, here we are, we're facing all the changes we need to make in terms of the COVID pandemic. But these things always apply to people, and people with ingenuity come up with solutions to things, and we look back on it and say, of course. But you have to understand that in 1870, when the first Atlantic City Boardwalk was built, it was the first boardwalk built anywhere. You know, nobody had a boardwalk. So imagine conceiving of this notion. It's pretty incredible. And we'll look back on these COVID times, and you know, 10 years from now, there'll be things that will say, well, of course, that's what we do. But no, we started doing those things because we needed to do something. So a guy named Alexander Boardman. Now, I mean, how ironic is it that a guy named Boardman built the boardwalk, the first boardwalk? Here's what's happening. There were hotels and stores built right up to the beach. You know, they were actually on the beach. And when I say they're on the beach, I mean their first floor wasn't even elevated. They were right on the beach. And so what was happening is that all the tourists were going to the beach, and then they're coming back to the hotels and to the stores and that kind of stuff. Or even if they're not going to the beach, if they're walking down in front of the hotels and the stores to do shopping or whatever, they're tracking sand everywhere. And anybody who's ever come to the shore and rented a place for a week, you know, sand is everywhere down here if you're not careful. So he came up with this idea to build a boardwalk in front of the hotels and the stores where people could walk along and not get so sandy. And don't forget, in those days, people wore long clothing. Men wore long pants. Women wore long skirts and dresses. So it's not like now where people had shorts and flip flops on. Where you could just dust your feet off. You're dragging sand in. It's not just sticking to you. You're dragging it in. So they built this boardwalk, 8 feet long, original boardwalk, and every winter it was dismantled and stored, which I think is just incredible to think about that. Next slide, please. All right, now, so 1870, the first little tiny boardwalk was built. Now, obviously, over the years, it got people said, listen, let's not take this down in the wintertime. Let's make something permanent, withstand storms, that sort of thing. So they built the boardwalk higher, a lot more structure to it, that sort of thing. In 1898, they built Steel Pier. Now, we tend to think of Steel Pier as the only pier that was in Atlantic City, but there was a lot of them, piers over the years, and they were built, they got wrecked, they were torn down, rebuilt, that sort of thing. But Steel Pier is the most enduring one, and it's still there today. In 1921, the first Miss America pageant was held at Steel Pier, and in 1929, that's when they introduced the diving horses. Now, if you don't know much about the diving horses, I mean, this was an act that went on for years and years and years. I think it's interesting that it started in 1929, because maybe those horses, that was when the Great Depression came, so maybe those horses were jumping for a reason. Uh, you know, but anyway, a great history of entertainment, Atlantic City. Steel Pier. We think of it today as you go in there and you pay to go on amusements, that sort of thing. But almost all the piers back then were a single price of admission. And so you'd pay a certain amount to get onto the pier, and then everything else was free. The rides were free. The acts, they had all kinds of shows going on all the time. They had dancing. And now you had to pay for food and that sort of thing, and drink. But all the entertainment was included in your one low admission price. Next slide, please. Now, it's hard for us to imagine this today with so many other choices people have. But Atlantic City used to be known as the world's playground. And it was really famous. And I mean, a lot of wealthy people came here. What's interesting too, Atlantic City, although a lot of wealthy people went there, the really, really wealthy people went down to Cape May. And Cape May, if you ever go down there, you see all these beautiful homes and that sort of thing, but much smaller, much less commercialized. But Atlantic City became a mass attraction, and it attracted people of all classes, because with the railroad being able to get you there from the Philadelphia area, people could get down for a day, and they priced it so that a family could come down, for a day and ride back up again. Now in the 1920s, Atlantic City became kind of infamous because, first of all, you have to understand, in the 20s we had prohibition. So you weren't allowed to sell or produce alcohol in the United States. You could produce some alcohol for religious purposes, like sacramental wine and that sort of thing. Some of the wineries in California would produce barrels of wine and sell it, and say have a warning label, a caution: do not add yeast and sugar, or contents will ferment. So there was ways of getting around it, but not in Atlantic City. They didn't worry about getting around it because they just had it. And so we had a lot of organized crime, but it's different than the organized crime we have today. There's a guy named Nucky Johnson, and his actual name was Enoch, and they call him Nucky Johnson. He became the boss of Atlantic City, and Atlantic City was just run by the Republican Party back then. There was virtually no Democratic Party influence there, and so there was ward bosses, and everything was run by the machine. But they also took care of the people. That was the thing, and so so even though they were pretty notorious people, the lifestyle of the local residents was pretty nice, because in order to keep on getting their vote, they had to deliver services to the people, and it was really pretty interesting. So it was a competent group of people running the city, although very crooked by the standards of the day because of the laws against it. So gambling, prostitution, liquor, sales were just rampant here. Next slide, please. Now here's an interesting quote from Nucky Johnson. We have women, wine, whiskey, song, and slots. So, and he said if people didn't want them, if the majority of people didn't want them, we wouldn't be able to sell it. Now, Atlantic City, you have to understand, this was an entertainment mecca here. People came here to be entertained and to spend their money. Philadelphia at that time was very, very puritanical and very strict. A lot of places had what was called blue laws at the time. Even when I had my restaurant and my hotel in Ocean City, which I had my hotel in 1972, my restaurant in 1973. We still had blue laws then. I don't even know when they ended, but they ended sometime after that. I think it was in the early 80s. And at the time, for example, with blue laws in Ocean City. Now, of course, Ocean City never had liquor. Well, I mean, it did at one point, but it doesn't now. The dry town, although you can certainly consume liquor there. You just can't buy it or sell it in Ocean City. But when I had my restaurant. I remember right across the street from me on 34th Street. My restaurant was on 34th and Wesley, and right across from the beach. And across the street from me was a drugstore, and they sold, pharmaceuticals and that kind of stuff, and aspirin and things like that. But they also sold things like beach balls and decks of cards and hula hoops and that kind of stuff. Well, they couldn't sell you a hula hoop on Sunday. You could buy aspirin, but you couldn't buy a hula hoop. So in this time now, Atlantic City became a place where people could go, and it prospered because they had the entertainment that people wanted and couldn't get someplace else. And one of the problems Atlantic City has now, one of the reasons it's not as popular as it was, there's a couple reasons. One is because people have air conditioning now. So in the summertime, they can stay home, and they have backyard pools and community pools, which they didn't have back then. So, you can stay home and not have to travel so far. And also the airplane really kind of killed Atlantic City because, Atlantic City, you could take the train here or drive here, and, New York and Philadelphia is major residential centers at the time, for example, in 1972, there was a gas crisis. When I had my restaurant, I guess it was 73, when I had my restaurant up on 34th Street, and there was a gas crisis, and you could only buy, we didn't have vanity license plates back then. You had a number on your license plate. And so if you had a license plate number that ended in an odd number, you could only buy gas on odd number days. And if you had one that ended in even numbers, you could only buy gas on even number days, which you were better off having an odd number because there was more odd numbers days in the year than even, because some months have 31. But anyway, but I saw an article at the time that at that time in 1973, 25% of the United States population lived within one tankful of gas of Atlantic City. So when it became so hard to travel, Atlantic City and Ocean City did well. But now I think we might be facing another time when we might start doing better because people can drive here, and people are not as keen about flying now as they are. So who knows what will happen. Next slide, please. All right, now let's talk about some memorable things that happened in Atlantic City. In the 1920s, and this is really interesting, there was a lot of theaters in Atlantic City. I mean, theaters like, where, see, you have to understand too, in the 20s, 30s, before television, you had movie theaters, but you also had a lot of live entertainment theaters where vaudeville acts were put on, where regular plays and stuff were done. Musicals were really big, the Ziegfeld Follies, all that kind of stuff. And so in the 20s, Atlantic City became a tryout ground for Broadway plays, like musicals especially. But so no one would open on Broadway without trying it first in Atlantic City. It just wasn't done. And there was a lot of theaters in Atlantic City. Maybe at some point we'll do a history of the theaters here. Now in the 30s, Kentucky Avenue began to be developed, and this became a jazz mecca. So there was a lot of clubs, honky tonks, that sort of thing, and the music scene in Atlantic City really grew. By the way, we're kind of seeing a resurgence of that today with some music venues. Live music entertainment has become much more popular again, although a lot of the music scene today is actually in the casinos. Where you have the different genre being brought back, and there's the nice thing about it. There's a lot of niche types of things. Like for example, over on the bay, the Golden Nugget over there, they appeal to a much more an older, less wealthy, sort of more local crowd. We go over there sometimes on Friday nights. They have bands that are cover bands, and it's I think it's $5 to get in. It's $5 for a drink, that kind of stuff. It's really fun to do. Now in the 40s, look at this, and this is an interesting thing about how things come full circle. In the 40s, of course, the war came along, World War II, and the convention center became a training facility for the troops. I remember as a kid living in Ocean City, there was actually an Army barracks over in Ocean City. They had an armory over there, and we used to go over and play softball and baseball on the field they have there. And sometimes we could play, sometimes we couldn't. Sometimes the soldiers were using it, but so that changed. But now look, what just happened here in Atlantic City during COVID? The new convention center was turned into a hospital. Remember, so Atlantic City has answered the call a lot of times. Now, 1950, Frank Sinatra. What a performer! I saw him in Las Vegas. By the time I saw him, he was no longer Frank Sinatra, but you know what? He was still Frank Sinatra. Oh my! What an entertainer that guy was. He attracted 41,000 people to Steel Pier in 1950, and interestingly, that record didn't stand long because Ricky Nelson did a concert there when he was first getting started, and he attracted even a few more. And then in 1953, interesting thing, the lifeguards. Two lifeguards used Steel Pier as the starting point for the Around the Island swim, which has taken place almost every year since then, and except for this year, it was canceled because of the COVID virus. I'll tell you one interesting thing. Now, I told you my grandparents had a grocery store in the 30s. Well, during World War II, my mother and her sisters were young ladies, and at the time they used to wear these corsages that had little battery operated lights in them. I guess it was battery operated. I just remember my mom telling me about that. And they used to have blackouts and air raid wardens because the danger was a lot of ships would leave New York and head down the coast, and then would be down to South America, whatever, across to Europe, that kind of thing, but or just feeding different places in the United States with supplies, that sort of thing. And German submarines in World War II operated off of Atlantic City because as these ships were coming along, the German submarines were further out to sea than the ships. And if Atlantic City was lit up at night along the boardwalk there, it silhouetted the ships, and a lot of ships were torpedoed out there, off the New Jersey coast line. So my mom was telling me about they had these corsages that lit up, and the air raid warden was screaming at them that to turn them out. They had to take them off and throw them away, that kind of stuff. So Atlantic City is it's been around a while. It's got a lot of history. Next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about the casino era here. Now, getting casinos approved was not easy. It was on the ballot in 1974, and it actually lost. And I can't remember exactly, but I think one of the reasons it may have lost was because it was a statewide push for gambling. And I believe, and I can't remember this exactly, but I believe that they made some revisions to the proposal and that sort of thing, and maybe it was either to limit the number of casinos or to limit the types of casinos. I think that's what have been it. It might have been to limit the types of casinos. You had to have so many hotel rooms and that kind of stuff. And it finally got passed in '77. Resorts International was the first casino built in Atlantic City. It was owned by Merv Griffin at the time, famous TV producer and daytime television star. He had a talk show and that sort of thing. And he invented a lot of the game shows that are on TV now. First one to produce them anyway. So 1978. 78. Yeah, 78 was when Resorts was built. Now, here's something pretty interesting. When Resorts first opened, it was mobbed. I mean, it was really mobbed. And to go in there, I can't remember if this was all day long, but I know to go in there in the evening, I had to wear a jacket and tie. I can't remember if I had to wear one or if you just felt out of place if you weren't wearing a jacket and tie. People really dressed up to go in there. I think it was actually had a dress code. And so I remember going in there a couple times when it first opened, wearing a jacket and tie. And by the way, that wasn't unusual because when I was a kid in Ocean City, to go up on the boardwalk, and certainly in Atlantic City, you dressed up. I mean, I remember my grandfather taking me up on the boardwalk, and we didn't go to the boardwalk every night, even though we lived in Ocean City, because it was like a special deal. And my grandfather would have a suit on. And in those days, all men wore hats and not the baseball caps. They wore, caps during the day if you're like a working man. But whenever you wore a jacket and tie, you wore a hat. Women wore high heels and dresses to go on the boardwalk. It was pretty amazing. So, and then in 1979, Caesars and Bally's opened. Now, I worked at Bally's in 1985, and I've always been confused because when we moved back up here in 2005 from Florida, we went over to Bally's, and I'm thinking to myself, I don't recognize this at all, and I knew where my office was, and I mean, you can't get up to where the offices are, obviously, but there was no. The stairway I remembered and where the elevator placement was, it just didn't look familiar. And just last year, I happened to be at an event at the Claridge Hotel, which is just north of Bally's, where Bally's is now. And I went walking in there with my wife and I to this event, and all of a sudden I was like struck. I hadn't been in the Claridge, as it turned out, since I left Bally's. Bally's used to be where the Claridge is. And I'm looking at this, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I suddenly know where I am. So I was really happy to find out. Now, obviously, since then, there's been some ups and down times for the casinos, but the Boardwalk has always been the main place for the casinos. You've got the Marina District. There's nothing like a Boardwalk casino, though. Next slide. So Atlantic City, we talked about then. Let's talk about Atlantic City now. We've got casinos, we've got entertainment, and we're all closed down during COVID. So Atlantic City right now is just, it makes me so sad. And it's so hard to live there and to work there just because we can't get out. We can't do the things that we're used to enjoying. Now, of course, it's opening up. And we'll see what Atlantic City now is by the time you're watching this slideshow. If this is 2021 or 2025 that you're watching this, who knows where Atlantic City now will be. A couple of interesting things that are still around, though. There's a place called the Ritz, which is now a condo. It used to be a hotel, and the remnants of the old Grand Staircase are there. That's where Nucky Johnson lived. There was also some famous meetings there of crime bosses and politicians and everything else. So it was a real headquarters for running the city back then. Let's see, the Knife and Fork Inn. Oh, right across the street from the AC campus. Hey, by the way, has a fantastic happy hour. And at their bar downstairs, and it's not necessarily that the drinks are inexpensive there. It's the appetizers are really inexpensive, and it's great. I love that bar. That was my my grandparents' favorite restaurant. Well, my grandfather in particular. My grandfather was he had a grocery store, but later on he was a restaurateur and bar owner up in Philadelphia. That was my mother's father, and my father's stepfather. My dad's father died when my dad was 4, but my dad's stepfather was a beer distributor. So my family was up in Philadelphia. We were always in the hospitality business, and they came to Atlantic City and then to Ocean City and so on. But the Knife and Fork was my maternal grandparents' favorite restaurant. They love that place, and I do too. I go there whenever I can. It's owned by the Doherty family now, who also owns Doc's Oyster House. They own Harry's Oyster Bar in Bally's. They do the food service out for the not the Atlantic City Country Club. Yeah, there might be. I can't remember if it's Atlantic City Country Club or Linwood Country Club. Really, really great restaurant family. Here's another thing too: the Absecon Lighthouse. Now remember, Absecon Island is the island that Atlantic City's on. That lighthouse used to be a way for bootleggers, rum runners, to find their way in. They used to have ships come up and unload into smaller boats and to run liquor ashore down there. And here's an interesting thing: whether this is true or not, it might just be a fable, but somebody said that they used to hang 2 red lanterns in the eyes of Lucy the elephant to warn bootleggers if it was not safe to to come ashore at that time. Anyway, folks, that's history of the boardwalk with a little smattering of my own family's personal history. Sorry about that, but I think it puts it into some historical context, and it also some context of the entertainment value that Atlantic City and that boardwalk have. Wish you all the best, and you know what? Hopefully soon we'll see you on the boardwalk.